Hugs, smiles, kisses, and a sigh of relief. An emotional homecoming for Wikileaks founder Julian Assange today as he reunited with his family in Australia. A 14-year-long legal battle came to an end as Assange pleaded guilty to violating American espionage law in a deal. Assange had faced a maximum jail sentence of 175 years after being charged with 17 counts of breaching the Espionage Act and hacking. Under this deal with the United States, he pled guilty to a single charge of espionage and walked free. Assange formally entered the charge on the remote Northern Mariana Islands, an American territory in the Pacific, 2 days after leaving London's Belmarsh prison. In return, he was sentenced to time already served and released to fly home. His lawyer, Jen Robinson, told media that the deal was criminalization of journalism and set a dangerous precedent. Remember, back in 2010, Wikileaks released several classified US military documents on America's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The over 7 lakh page documents included battlefield accounts such as a 2007 video of a US Apache helicopter firing at suspected insurgents in Iraq, killing a dozen people, including 2 Reuters journalists. Following the leaks, Assange was indicted by the then US President Donald Trump's administration under the Espionage Act. Not just this, Assange had faced separate charges of rape and sexual assault in Sweden as well, which he had denied. He spent 7 years hiding in Ecuador's London embassy, claiming the Swedish case would lead him to be sent to the US. Swedish authorities dropped that case in 2019 and said that too much time had passed since the original complaint. While the United Nations has hailed the release of Assange, Australian Prime Minister Albanese has said that he's very pleased with the Julian Assange deal. But what does it say about the press freedom, state, as well as how this case moves forward and how this case has been? Let's talk more about this on the broadcast. I'm joined by Ray Locker. He is a senior journalist and author. Ray, good evening. Namaskar. Thank you very much for joining us on Mirror Now. Finally, we have visuals of Julian Assange reuniting with his family, something that, a lot of people have, waited to see for all these years. But your first reaction, your first thoughts on this entire case, and now with these visuals coming in and Julian Assange walking free?
Well, Shreya, I think it's time for this to be over. I mean, he's done plenty of time either hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy or in Belmarsh prison in the United Kingdom. He pleaded guilty to 1 count, which doesn't seem like that serious of a charge. So it's good that it's over. I have very conflicted feelings about Julian Assange. I've used WikiLeaks material in the past on reporting about the U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of it was tremendously valuable. On the other hand, he participated in some pretty heinous conspiracy theories, such as the one involving former Democratic National Committee employee Seth Rich, who was murdered in Washington and got caught up into this crazy conspiracy theory that somehow, because he leaked information to Julian Assange, he was killed. Well, he didn't leak information to WikiLeaks. That came from Russian hackers. And Assange could have said something about it and never really did. So I don't look at him as a hero. I think this is something that it's good that it's over. He served enough time. He's pleaded guilty. And I think it's time to move on.
Ray, also help us understand how this deal with the US court works and how it operates, how it helped Julian Assange, because this is not something that happens in commonplace, something that we don't see very often in cases like these. But how does this, work in this entire matter?
Well, we've had similar cases in the past and people have gone to prison. For example, the case of Chelsea Manning, who was previously known as Bradley Manning, a U.S. soldier who delivered all that stuff in 2010 to WikiLeaks. She went to prison. She was charged, convicted, and went to prison for leaking that information. And now she's out and a free citizen, free to say whatever she wants. In the early 1970s, Daniel Ellsberg, the military analyst involved in the Pentagon Papers case, he leaked those papers to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers. He was charged and tried twice, never convicted, but he saw his day in court. So that's something that Assange until today didn't have because he didn't put himself up to go to trial. Probably was worried about what would happen to him. I don't blame him, but these other cases, those people faced trial and it was adjudicated and they came out one way or the other.
Ray, his wife, Stella Assange, has said, and I'm going to quote her, she said that she hopes the media realize the danger of this conviction for news gathering and publishing information that was in the public interest. How do you see this statement really in the context of what Julian Assange had been convicted for back in 2010?
Well, I don't look at Julian Assange as a journalist. I think he had information that he just released willy-nilly to the public, exposed the names of people who were put in danger, some of them who were killed. And I don't think he used the type of analysis that certainly I tried to do and the people I've always worked with tried to do when they do journalism. I mean, like I said, I've used WikiLeaks material. I had to confirm the chain of custody of that information and balance it with what other people said about it. I don't think he did that. I don't think he did that in the case of the DNC emails that he leaked during the 2016 campaign. And so I think in a lot of ways, I don't see him as a journalist. And I think it's a blurry line, and I understand people who do believe it. I just don't agree with it.
Which is what I was coming to next, Ray, that this is a very blurred line. This is a very gray area. You can't really put it as black and white as clearly as we would want it to be. There are supporters of Julian Assange. There are people who empathize with him and say that, whatever he did was in the larger interest of the public and that things which the public wouldn't have known otherwise were made known by the likes of Julian Assange.
Yeah, that's true. And like I said, he had help from people who actually took that information and released it to the public. He was a conduit. And I think that if he had been a more effective journalist and relayer of that information, he would have provided some more analysis with it instead of just, sticking it out online and letting people kind of figure it all out with kind of no interpretation. We've seen other stories where information has been released and there was that kind of analysis. For example, Edward Snowden in 2013, he released a lot of that information that he stole from the National Security Administration to news organizations that applied the standards of legitimate journalism. The Washington Post, The Guardian, they looked at it, they evaluated it, they talked to other people about it before they published it. And I think that's the way that it should go. And I don't think Assange always did that. And that's part of the problem I have with him. In the end, was the public served by some of that information? I think so. I think that 2000 video of the U.S. attack in Iraq was, kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people. But it followed on top of, 4 years of reporting on how bad things were in Iraq and a war that the United States didn't need to start. So he was valuable, but I don't think he was the sole person who provided that kind of information.
So, Ray, do you think that, perhaps whatever Julian Assange did back then was his effort, his bid to gain his 15 minutes of fame, and that perhaps snowballed into a larger case that prolonged for so many years?
Well, there are always consequences to your actions, when you do something like that. People who are keeping that information don't take that lightly. So if you're involved in leaking that to the public, you're going to make a lot of people mad. And for sometimes legitimate reasons and sometimes for not legitimate reasons. So you can expect something's going to happen to you. Look at Edward Snowden. I mean, now he's living in Russia. Those are the consequences of his actions by releasing that information. You don't just stick it online and hope that nobody pays attention or you get away with it or you become famous without consequences. I mean, every news organization has consequences to what it publishes. And I've had to deal with that in my career. You
No.
do something, people don't like it, and they're going to criticize you. They're going to come at you if they can. They're going to take you to court. So if he didn't think that that was going to happen to him, he was extremely naive.
I think you very rightly put it, Ray, that, as journalists, we walk that fine line every day when we come to work, and we have to, strike that balance between what we say, what we do, and how it matters and how it impacts the public and the consequences of it. But I also want to shift our focus, Ray, to how Australia navigated its way through this entire matter. Initially, you didn't have very many officials of the Australian government very keen on talking about it with the United States, thinking that it might, affect their bilateral relationship. But then later on, in the past few years, you had the Australian government talking to the Biden government, the Biden administration about it, and, talking about this issue every time they had a chance to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the newly elected Albanese government, the Labor government in Australia, looked at this and said, it's probably in our best interest to make this go away, to end it now. And I think the Biden administration did the same. Um, as you mentioned earlier, it was a Trump administration that charged him with espionage. And I think after enough time had passed, that both countries said, we don't really need to keep doing this. It's a problem between us that the guy's been in prison or hiding out for such a long time that it's no longer worth it. And that happens a lot of times where you're like, okay, look, we're tired of talking about this every time we have a meeting. Let's just make it go away. He faced one count, he pleaded guilty, now he's free. And so we can move on with the other more important things about our relationship.
Hmm. Um, do you also think, Ray, how do you think it would have had a larger impact on the relationship between the United States and Australia, if at all?
I mean, if it had continued, maybe. I mean, obviously the guy was suffering in prison, and we helped put him there. So if he died in prison, that wouldn't have been a good thing. I think there was a growing feeling in Australia that he had served enough time and he needed to be let out. And to get back to the bigger issue of all this, the United States bears responsibility in this. We had very sloppy controls over classified information. I mean, there was information about Chelsea Manning when she was in the Army that she was somebody who had, psychological issues, was probably just not the kind of person you want sitting on a big pile of classified information. And, that's the US government and the military's problem for not taking better care of that. And so, I hope that the military has learned to better safeguard those kind of materials. I certainly think in the case of Donald Trump, he hasn't. I mean, he had classified information in the
Hmm.
bathroom of his house. So we bear a responsibility to take better care of that information. Assange exploited that weakness. He's paid for it, and now he's free.
Okay. My last question, Ray, what sort of precedents do you then think this entire case has set for people in the future, journalists and non-journalists alike, who leak information, crucial information that might be impacting the government as well as the public?
There's always going to be somebody who has information who thinks he or she has a greater duty to the public to leak it. And so that's going to keep happening. I don't think this is going to be a precedent for somebody who's so motivated to do that. Well, they'll say, oh, I'm not going to do it. No, they'll do it anyway. And then we'll see how it plays out. I mean, it's kind of like, people talk about the death penalty being a deterrent for murder. If you want to kill somebody, you're going to do it. You don't think, oh, I might get the death penalty. So if you're motivated to be a leaker and you think you have a greater duty to the world and public to leak it, you probably will. If you're kind of on the bubble thinking, well, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not, you might look at this and think otherwise. And certainly there have been enough cases in the past, as I mentioned, the Pentagon Papers, Edward Snowden, where people can
Yeah.
look and say, there are ramifications for doing this. Am I willing to take that chance?
Hmm. All right, we'll leave it there. Ray Locker, thank you very much to you for joining us on Nation tonight and helping us understand and sharing your perspective on this entire case. Thank you very much, Ray.
Thank you.